Have you ever walked into a store, excited to spend your hard-earned money, only to be judged by the color of your skin? That's exactly what happened to Sarah Chen last summer at the Riverside Boutique, a high-end clothing store she dreamed of shopping at since she was a teenager. But what the store's racist manager didn't know that day would change everything. Sarah wasn't just any customer. She was about to become his boss. Let me take you back to that sweltering July afternoon in downtown Portland. Sarah had just landed a major deal with her tech startup, and she wanted to treat herself to something special. After months of wearing the same rotation of hoodies and jeans to investor meetings, she figured it was time to upgrade her wardrobe. The bell chimed as she pushed open the heavy glass door of Riverside Boutique, the store's air conditioning a welcome relief from the heat. The first thing Sarah noticed was the pristine white marble floors and crystal chandeliers that made the boutique feel more like a palace than a clothing store. Designer dresses in every color lined the walls, their price tags containing more zeros than she ever seen on clothing before. But Sarah didn't mind. Today was her day to splurge. As she ran her fingers along the silk of a midnight blue evening gown, she noticed the store manager, Richard Thompson, watching her from behind the counter. His eyes followed her every move, not with the attentiveness of good customer service, but with suspicion. Sarah was used to this. Being a young Asian woman in tech had taught her plenty about prejudice, but she wasn't going to let it ruin her day. "Can I help you?" Richard's voice cut through the store's soft background music, sharp and unwelcoming. Before Sarah could respond, he added, "These pieces might be a bit out of your price range." The way he emphasized those last two words made his meaning crystal clear. Sarah smiled politely, years of dealing with condescending investors having taught her patience. "Actually, I'd love to try on the blue gown in the window. Size 4, please." She pulled out her phone, pretending not to notice how Richard's eyes narrowed at her designer phone case, a gift from her sister. "I don't think that would be necessary," Richard replied, moving from behind the counter. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the mall down the street. They have more suitable options for someone like you." The handful of other customers browsing the racks pretended not to hear, but Sarah could see their discomfort reflected in the store's many mirrors. A young sales associate named Maya stood frozen by the accessories display, her name tag glinting under the chandelier lights, clearly conflicted about whether to intervene. Sarah's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Someone like me? I'd love to hear exactly what you mean by that, Richard." She made a point of reading his name tag, though she already knew exactly who he was. The store's Yelp reviews had told her everything she needed to know about Richard Thompson's selective customer service. What happened next would become the talk of Portland's retail community for months to come. Richard, emboldened by years of never facing consequences for his actions, decided to make an example of Sarah. He walked to the door and held it open, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. Please leave before I call security." Maya gasped audibly. An elderly woman shopping nearby clutched her pearls. And Sarah? She just smiled, took out her phone, and made a call. "Hi, is this Mr. Harrison?" "Yes, I think we should move up our meeting about the Riverside acquisition. Something just came up that I need to address immediately." She paused, looking directly at Richard, whose face had begun to show the first hints of uncertainty. "No, I don't need to see the other locations. I just had a very illuminating experience at the flagship store." You see, what Richard didn't know was that Sarah Chen wasn't just another customer. She was the CEO of Nova Retail Partners, the company that had been in confidential negotiations to buy the Riverside boutique chain. The papers were nearly ready to sign, and Sarah had decided to do one final round of secret shopping at their locations before closing the deal. The color drained from Richard's face as he began to piece together what was happening. Maya, the young sales associate, couldn't help but let a small smile slip. The other customers stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like the climax of a movie they hadn't expected to be part of. But what happened next? Well, that's where things get really interesting. Let's just say Richard's world was about to turn upside down, and Sarah was about to teach everyone a lesson about judging books by their covers, or in this case, judging customers by their appearance. Before I tell you how Sarah handled this situation, and trust me, it's not what you might expect, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what happens next in this true story of karma, redemption, and the changing face of retail in America. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about making change. And change was exactly what Riverside Boutique was about to experience. Welcome back. Now, before I tell you what Sarah did next, let me share something important about her story. 3 years before this incident, Sarah was working 80-hour weeks in a tiny apartment, coding between deliveries from her side gig as a food courier. She'd pitched her retail analytics software to 57 investors before finally getting her first yes. That yes changed everything. Sarah's company, Nova Retail Partners, didn't just create software, it revolutionized how stores operated. Her AI-driven system could predict shopping patterns, optimize inventory, and most importantly, track customer satisfaction in real time. But what really set her company apart was its emphasis on inclusive retail experiences. Sarah had faced discrimination in stores too many times to count, and she was determined to change the industry from the inside out. When the opportunity to acquire Riverside Boutique came up, Sarah saw more than just a business opportunity. The chain had 5 locations across the Pacific Northwest and a reputation for luxury fashion. But it also had something else. Dozens of complaints about discriminatory treatment buried in online reviews and social media posts. Sarah had spent weeks reading through them all, noting the patterns, the names that kept coming up, especially Richard Thompson's. Standing there in the store that day, Sarah thought about Maya, the young sales associate who looked so uncomfortable with Richard's behavior. Maya reminded Sarah of herself at that age, wanting to speak up but feeling powerless to change anything. The other customers in the store had started to whisper among themselves, smartphones discreetly recording the scene. Sarah knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd ever been made to feel less than worthy because of who they were. She turned back to Richard, who was still holding the door open, though his arm had started to tremble slightly. "You know what, Richard? I think I will leave. But first, let me introduce myself properly. I'm Sarah Chen, CEO of Nova Retail Partners, and as of next week, I was supposed to be your new boss." The silence that followed was deafening. A woman browsing the jewelry counter actually dropped her purse. Maya's eyes went wide as saucers, and she quickly pulled out her phone, presumably to Google Sarah's name. Richard's face went through a remarkable transformation, from smug superiority to confusion, then to horror as reality sank in. "Ms. Chen, I had no idea," Richard stammered, letting the door swing closed. "Please, let me explain. This is all a misunderstanding. I was simply trying to maintain our stores, our standards." His voice trailed off as he realized every word was making things worse. Sarah held up her hand. "Your standards? Let's talk about standards, Richard. I've read every review of this store for the past 3 years. I know about the black college professor you followed around the store last month. I know about the Hispanic executive you accused of trying to steal a handbag, the same bag she just purchased. I know about the elderly Asian couple you told to go to Chinatown instead." She pulled out her tablet and started scrolling through screenshots of reviews. By now, a small crowd had gathered outside the store's windows, drawn by the drama unfolding inside. Someone had obviously started live streaming the encounter, and local social media was lighting up with notifications. Richard's face had gone from red to pale and back again. Maya stepped forward, clutching her phone. "It's true," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I've wanted to report it so many times, but," she glanced at Richard, years of intimidation evident in her hesitation. Sarah smiled encouragingly at Maya before turning back to Richard. "I came here today because I wanted to see for myself if the reviews were accurate. I wanted to believe they were isolated incidents, maybe misunderstandings. I wanted to believe that the store's reputation for exclusivity hadn't become an excuse for exclusion." She paused, letting her words sink in. The other customers had stopped pretending not to listen and were openly watching now. An older woman in a designer suit nodded approvingly at Sarah's words, while a young man by the shoe display was furiously typing on his phone, probably sharing the story on social media. "The acquisition papers are sitting on my desk right now," Sarah continued. "But before I sign them, I have some decisions to make. Decisions about the future of this store, its policies, and its leadership." She looked pointedly at Richard, whose arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization that his actions might have consequences. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because what Sarah did next surprised everyone, including Richard. She didn't call security to escort him out, like he threatened to do to her. She didn't demand he be fired on the spot. Instead, she pulled out a business card and held it out to Maya. "I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we could make this store more welcoming to everyone," Sarah said to the young sales associate. "Maybe over coffee tomorrow morning?" The look of hope that spread across Maya's face was matched only by the look of dread on Richard's. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying someone's world. It's about building a better one right in front of them. But what happened at that coffee meeting? And what changes did Sarah have planned for Riverside Boutique? Well, that's where this story gets really interesting, because sometimes the biggest transformations come from the most unexpected places, and what happened next would change not just one store, but an entire industry's approach to customer service. Stay tuned for the next part of this story, where we'll reveal exactly how Sarah turned this moment of discrimination into a movement for change. And trust me, you won't believe how Richard reacts when he discovers what's coming next. The next morning, at a cozy coffee shop 2 blocks from Riverside Boutique, Sarah sat across from Maya, watching as the young sales associate nervously stirred her latte. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the tears that had started to form in Maya's eyes as she finally felt safe enough to share her story. "I've worked there for 3 years," Maya began, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first, I thought Richard was just particular about customers, but then I started noticing the patterns." She pulled out a small notebook from her bag, filled with dates, times, and detailed accounts of incidents she witnessed. "I've been keeping track, hoping someday someone would listen." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Maya's hand. "I'm listening now," she said softly. What Maya revealed next would become the foundation of the biggest transformation in Riverside Boutique's history. Meanwhile, back at the store, word had spread quickly about yesterday's confrontation. Richard had called an emergency meeting with his remaining loyal staff members, desperately trying to damage control. But the videos had already gone viral, with hashtag RiverCitiracism and hashtag SarahChenStyle trending locally on social media. "She doesn't understand our clientele," Richard insisted to his small group of supporters. "We have a certain image to maintain." But as he spoke, even his most devoted employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. They'd seen the writing on the wall. Change was coming, whether Richard liked it or not. What Richard didn't know was that Sarah had spent the previous night reviewing security footage from all 5 Riverside locations. She discovered something interesting. Stores with more diverse staff had consistently higher sales figures. The data didn't lie. Inclusivity wasn't just morally right, it was good for business. But Sarah wasn't just planning a simple management change. She had a vision for transforming Riverside Boutique into a model of inclusive luxury retail. And surprisingly, some unexpected allies were emerging to help her make it happen. Later that afternoon, Sarah received an email from Charlotte Harrison, wife of the current owner. "I've been ashamed of what's happening in our stores," Charlotte wrote. "My husband built this business on quality and service, not discrimination. We need to make this right." The plot thickened when several high-profile fashion influencers, who'd previously praised Riverside's exclusivity, began sharing their own uncomfortable experiences with Richard. One popular stylist posted a video recounting how Richard had once questioned the authenticity of her designer handbag simply because she was wearing streetwear that day. But perhaps the most surprising development came from an unexpected source. Richard's assistant manager, James. He requested a private meeting with Sarah, bringing with him 5 years' worth of customer complaints that Richard had deliberately buried. "I wanted to speak up so many times," James explained, his hands shaking as he handed over the files. But Richard always found ways to silence people who questioned him. The documents revealed something even more disturbing. Richard hadn't just discriminated against customers. He'd systematically prevented qualified candidates from diverse backgrounds from being hired. The papers showed a clear pattern of talented applicants being rejected for increasingly absurd reasons. Sarah spent hours in her office that night, reviewing everything she'd learned. Maya's notebook, James's files, the security footage, the social media storm. She was building a case, not just for removing Richard, but for completely reimagining what luxury retail could be. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight. Through his expensive lawyer, he sent a lengthy email to Sarah and the current owners, threatening legal action for defamation and claiming he had documented proof that all of his actions were justified by store policy. He was betting that the fear of a messy legal battle would protect him, just as it had in the past. What he didn't count on was Sarah's next move. As she sat in her office late that night, looking out over the city lights, she received an unexpected call. It was from someone who'd worked with Richard at his previous job, before Riverside Boutique, and what they had to say would change everything. The next morning, Sarah walked into Riverside Boutique again. This time, Richard wasn't there. He called in sick. But Maya was, and so were several other employees who'd reached out overnight with their own stories. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. Sarah gathered the staff together, her tablet in hand containing the announcement that would reshape not just Riverside Boutique, but the entire concept of luxury retail in Portland. But before she could speak, her phone buzzed with a text message that made her pause. It was from Richard, and its contents would throw everything into chaos. What was in that message? And how would it affect Sarah's plans for transformation? Well, that's where this story takes its most dramatic turn yet, because sometimes the biggest obstacles to change come from the most unexpected places, and what Richard did next would test not just Sarah's business acumen, but her very belief in the possibility of redemption. Stay tuned for our next video, where we'll reveal the shocking contents of Richard's message and see exactly how Sarah turned this crisis into an opportunity for real, lasting change. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the truth about Richard's past finally comes to light. Sarah stared at her phone, her hand trembling slightly as she read Richard's message again. Before you make any decisions, there's something you need to see. Check your email. You're not the only one who's been gathering evidence. Attached was a video file that made Sarah's blood run cold. The store staff watched anxiously as their potential new owner's face went through a range of emotions. Maya stepped forward, concern written across her features. "Ms. Chen, is everything okay?" But Sarah was already heading toward the store's office, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. What Sarah found in her email would test everything she stood for. Richard had sent security footage from 6 months ago, footage that had been carefully edited to make it appear as though several high-profile incidents of discrimination had been fabricated by disgruntled customers. He even included statements from what he claimed were satisfied customers defending his actions. But there was something else. Something that made Sarah pause her finger over the forward to legal button. In the background of one of the clips, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was a detail that didn't add up. She'd seen enough doctored evidence in her tech career to know when something wasn't quite right. Meanwhile, the story had exploded beyond Portland. National news outlets had picked up on the viral videos, and suddenly Riverside Boutique had become the centerpiece of a larger conversation about discrimination in luxury retail. Hashtags were trending, think pieces were being written, and competitors were scrambling to distance themselves from similar practices. That's when Charlotte Harrison, the owner's wife, arrived at the store unannounced. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady as she asked to speak with Sarah privately. "There's something you need to know about Richard," she began, pulling out a worn manila envelope from her designer bag. "Something we should have dealt with years ago." The staff watched through the office windows as Sarah and Charlotte talked, their animated gestures suggesting an intense conversation. Maya clutched her notebook tighter, wondering if she should share what she'd discovered in the store's basement archives last night. Old employee records that told a very different story about Richard's history with the company. James, the assistant manager, paced nervously by the counter, checking his phone every few minutes. He received a strange call that morning from someone claiming to be from Richard's previous employer, and the information they'd shared made him question everything he thought he knew about his boss. Suddenly, the store's front door chimed. Everyone turned to look, and the air seemed to freeze. Richard stood there, impeccably dressed as always, but something was different. The usual smugness was gone from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. In his hand was a leather portfolio that seemed to carry the weight of secrets. "I think it's time we all had a conversation," he announced, his voice carrying across the now silent store. "About the truth." He looked directly at Sarah through the office windows, holding up the portfolio. "All of it." Sarah emerged from the office, Charlotte close behind her. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Security cameras whirred quietly overhead, recording what was about to become neither the biggest scandal in Portland retail history or its most remarkable transformation. That's when Maya stepped forward, her notebook open to a page that would change everything. "Before anyone says anything else," she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been, "I think there's something everyone needs to see." She looked at Richard, whose face had suddenly gone pale. Something from 3 years ago. Sarah watched as Richard's confident facade began to crack. She thought about the evidence in her email, Charlotte's manila envelope, James's mysterious phone call, and now Maya's notebook. Like pieces of a puzzle, they were all about to fall into place, but which version of the truth would emerge? The next few moments would determine not just the fate of Riverside Boutique, but the careers and reputations of everyone involved. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next decision would ripple through the retail industry for years to come. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Richard did something that nobody expected. He reached into his portfolio and pulled out a document that made Charlotte gasp audibly. "Before you say anything," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky, "there's something you all need to understand about why I did what I did." The document in his hands held secrets that would shock everyone in the room. But what were they? And how would they affect Sarah's plans for justice and transformation? Well, that's where this story reaches its most intense moment yet. Because sometimes the truth is more complicated than anyone expects, and what Richard was about to reveal would challenge everything everyone thought they knew about this situation. Stay tuned for our next video, where all the pieces finally come together, and we discover just how Sarah handles the biggest challenge of her career. Trust me, what happens next will change the way you think about justice, redemption, and the power of facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The document Richard held was shaking in his hands, not from fear, but from something else entirely. As he laid it on the counter, everyone could see it was a medical report dated 3 years ago. "I started pushing people away," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "when I got the diagnosis." But Sarah wasn't looking at the medical report. Her eyes were fixed on Maya, who had stepped forward with her notebook open to a specific page. "That's not the whole story," Maya said firmly. "And I think it's time everyone knew the truth." Maya's notebook revealed something extraordinary, a pattern that no one had noticed before. Every single person Richard had pushed out of the store over the past 3 years had reminded him of someone from his past. Someone very specific. Charlotte Harrison's hands flew to her mouth as realization dawned. "Lisa," she whispered. "They all reminded you of Lisa." The store fell silent as Richard nodded slowly. Lisa had been his daughter, a successful fashion designer who'd faced discrimination throughout her career because of her mixed-race background. She'd passed away 3 years ago, just as she was finally breaking through in the industry. The medical report wasn't his, it was hers. "I couldn't save her," Richard said, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking. "So I tried to protect our store's reputation the only way I knew how, by keeping out anyone who reminded me of how the industry treated her. I became the very thing that had hurt her the most." Sarah stepped forward, holding up her tablet. "But that's not all, is it?" On the screen was an email thread she'd discovered. Dozens of messages from Richard to major fashion houses, privately advocating for more diverse representation in their campaigns. He'd been fighting his own battle behind the scenes, even as his public actions told a different story. James cleared his throat. "The call I received this morning." It was from the diversity director at Fashion Forward magazine. Apparently, Richard has been anonymously funding scholarships for minority fashion students for the past 3 years. The revelation stunned everyone in the store. Richard's discrimination hadn't been born of hatred. It had grown from a twisted attempt to protect others from the pain his daughter had experienced. But in doing so, he'd become part of the very system that had hurt her. Sarah looked around the room, at the faces watching and waiting for her decision. The easy choice would be to fire Richard, to make him the scapegoat for a larger industry problem. But Sarah Chen hadn't built her company by taking the easy path. "Here's what we're going to do," she announced, her voice clear and determined. "Riverside Boutique is going to change, but not just in the ways everyone expects. Richard, you're not fired, you're being reassigned." She pulled up another document on her tablet. "This is the proposal for the Lisa Thompson Foundation for Fashion Inclusion. Richard, you're going to help run it. Turn your pain into purpose. Use your experience to make real change. The surprise on Richard's face was matched by the murmurs of approval from the staff. But Sarah wasn't finished. Maya, you're being promoted to store manager. Your attention to detail and courage in standing up for what's right is exactly what we need. James, you'll lead our new corporate training program on inclusive customer service. As Sarah laid out her vision, something remarkable happened. The tension in the room began to transform into something else: hope. Richard, who had spent years building walls, felt them finally beginning to crumble. But the story's biggest surprise came 3 months later at the grand reopening of Riverside Boutique. As Sarah cut the ribbon, surrounded by a diverse crowd of customers and staff, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. It was Lisa's best friend from design school, now a famous fashion designer herself. In her hands was a portfolio, Lisa's final collection, never before seen. She would have wanted it here, the designer said, handing the portfolio to Richard, where everyone is welcome. The collection became the centerpiece of Riverside Boutique's new inclusive luxury line, with proceeds going to the Lisa Thompson Foundation. The store that had once been known for exclusivity became famous for something else, proving that true luxury isn't about keeping people out, but about bringing them in. And Richard, well, they say the hardest person to forgive is yourself. But every time he sees a young designer walk into the foundation's offices, carrying dreams as big as Lisa's had been, he takes another step toward healing. As for Sarah Chen, she didn't just buy a store that day, she sparked a movement. Riverside Boutique's transformation became a case study in how to address discrimination in retail, proving that the path to change sometimes leads through understanding, not just accountability. Today, if you walk into Riverside Boutique, you'll see Lisa's designs displayed prominently near the entrance, along with a simple plaque that reads, "Fashion is for everyone," and beneath it, in smaller letters, "In memory of Lisa Thompson, who taught us that true style knows no boundaries." Sometimes the greatest acts of revenge aren't about getting even, they're about getting better. And in the end, that's exactly what everyone at Riverside Boutique did. Thank you for watching this incredible true story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe in the power of transformation. Remember, change starts with understanding, and understanding starts with listening to each other's stories. The document Richard held wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't evidence of customer fraud, or proof of store policies, or even a legal threat. It was a handwritten letter, dated 15 years ago, from his grandmother, a Chinese immigrant who'd been turned away from this very store in the 1960s. "I became everything I hated." Richard's voice cracked as he began to read. "I thought if I could be the perfect example of their standards, if I could prove I was better than how they once treated us, somehow it would erase the past." His hand shook as he lowered the letter. Instead, I just continued the cycle. Sarah stood silent, the pieces finally clicking into place. The security footage Richard had sent wasn't meant to threaten her. It was his confession. He deliberately included the signs of editing, wanting someone to finally catch him, to stop him. Maya stepped forward, opening her notebook. "That's why you hired me, isn't it?" 3 years ago, when no other luxury store would give a chance to a black girl fresh out of community college, she turned to Sarah. "He's been different with the staff, harsh sometimes, but he gave opportunities to people who didn't fit the luxury retail image. It was only with customers that I became a monster," Richard finished. "I thought I was proving something, showing that I could be better than those who once looked down on my family. Instead, I just became exactly like them." Charlotte Harrison moved to the center of the room, clutching her manila envelope. "That's why I'm here," she said, pulling out a stack of papers. "These are the original documents from when my husband bought this store. The previous owners had explicit policies about maintaining certain standards, code words for discrimination. We thought we'd change things by removing those policies, but we never addressed the culture that allowed them to exist." Sarah looked around the room, at Maya's determination, at James's guilt for staying silent so long, at Charlotte's desire to make things right, and at Richard's broken facade of superiority. She thought about her own journey, about all the times she'd been judged, dismissed, underestimated. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled out her phone and dialed. "Mr. Harrison? Yes, I'd like to proceed with the acquisition, but with one condition." She put the phone on speaker. "I want to create a program, the Riverside Retail Innovation Fellowship, a paid training program for people who face discrimination in retail, teaching them not just sales, but management, buying, everything they need to transform this industry from the inside out. She looked directly at Richard. And I want you to help run it. Not as a manager, but as someone who can speak firsthand about how prejudice poisons both the victim and the perpetrator. You'll work under Maya. She's being promoted to store director. The silence in the room was deafening. Maya's eyes widened in shock. Richard's face showed a mix of shame and something else. Hope? Maybe. Charlotte wiped away tears as she nodded in approval. But here's the twist, Sarah continued. Every fellow who completes the program will get seed funding to start their own boutique. Riverside won't just change its own culture, we're going to transform the entire luxury retail landscape, one store at a time. That's when James stepped forward with his phone. You might want to see this, he said, showing them the local news website. The videos of Sarah confronting Richard had sparked a movement. Other luxury stores across the country were facing their own reckonings, with employees and customers sharing similar stories of discrimination. 6 months later, Riverside Boutique's grand reopening made headlines, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Yes, the store was packed with customers of all backgrounds, browsing racks that now featured diverse designers and inclusive size ranges. Yes, Maya was excelling in her role as director, with profits up 40% under her leadership. But the real story was in the back room, where Richard, now dressed in a simple shirt and slacks instead of his designer suits, was teaching the first class of Riverside Fellows. I used to think luxury was about exclusion, he told them. Now I understand it's about transformation. And Sarah? She was already scouting locations for the first graduate-owned boutiques. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even or proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's about breaking cycles of hurt and creating something new in their place. But just when everyone thought the story was over, Maya discovered something in those old basement archives, something that would spark an even bigger change in the fashion industry. And that, my friends, is a story for another day. Remember to like and subscribe to catch the next installment, where we'll reveal Maya's discovery and see how one store's transformation sparked a retail revolution. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the most unexpected places, with the most unlikely allies. And this change was just the beginning. 1 year later, the Riverside Boutique's transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. The store that once symbolized exclusivity had become a beacon of change in the retail industry. But the real story wasn't in the sales figures or the magazine features. It was in the lives that had been transformed. Let me take you inside the store on a typical Tuesday morning. Maya, dressed in a stunning outfit from one of their new inclusive designers, was leading a team meeting in what used to be Richard's old office. The space had been completely redesigned. The imposing mahogany desk replaced with a comfortable round table, the walls now covered with photos of their diverse team and successful fellowship graduates. Our first class of fellows is graduating next week, Maya announced, beaming with pride. All 15 of them have their business plans ready, and you won't believe what just came across my desk. She held up a magazine featuring one of their fellows, a former homeless woman named Teresa who created a revolutionary adaptive clothing line. She's already got pre-orders from 3 major department stores. In the training room downstairs, Richard was different from the man we met at the beginning of this story. Gone was the designer suit armor he'd once hidden behind. Instead, he wore a simple button-down shirt and listened intently as a young fellow shared her experiences of discrimination in the fashion industry. I used to think I was protecting this store's legacy, Richard told his class later that day, but I was actually dishonoring it. My grandmother didn't survive discrimination so I could inflict it on others. She survived so I could help break the cycle. His grandmother's letter, now framed on the wall, served as a daily reminder of how far he'd come. Sarah's vision had expanded far beyond Portland. The Riverside Retail Innovation Fellowship had partnered with fashion schools nationwide, offering scholarships to students from underrepresented backgrounds. But perhaps the most surprising partnership came from Charlotte Harrison herself. Remember that discovery Maya made in the basement archives? Turns out, in the 1940s, Riverside Boutique had actually been owned by a black woman named Elizabeth Rivers. Her name had been deliberately obscured when she was forced to sell the store during the Jim Crow era. Charlotte, upon learning this, made it her mission to track down Elizabeth's descendants. Which brings us to the most emotional moment of the year, the day Elizabeth Rivers' granddaughter, Dr. Janet Rivers, walked into the store. She'd become a professor of fashion history, dedicated to uncovering erased stories like her grandmother's. Now, she was joining the fellowship program as a lead instructor, helping new generations reclaim their place in the fashion industry. The store itself had undergone a physical transformation that matched its cultural one. The intimidating marble floors remained, but now they led to welcoming spaces designed for everyone. A wheelchair-accessible runway hosted regular fashion shows featuring local designers. The once exclusive VIP room had become a community space where fellowship students could meet with mentors. But the biggest change was in the customers. On any given day, you'd find a teenage girl trying on her first prom dress while her hijab-wearing mother chatted with a sales associate about modest fashion options. A transgender man would be getting fitted for a suit, while an elderly couple browsed adaptive clothing that combined style with functionality. The store had become what it always should have been, a place where fashion truly was for everyone. Even the social media storm that had started it all had evolved into something positive. The hashtag Riversiderism hashtag had been reclaimed as hashtag Reversiderizing, with people sharing stories of inclusion and transformation. The store's TikTok account, run by the fellows, had gone viral with their Fashion is Your Right series, teaching young people about style, confidence, and standing up against discrimination. As for James, the assistant manager who'd finally spoken up, he found his calling leading the store's corporate training program, teaching other retailers how to identify and address systemic bias. His mysterious phone call from that dramatic day had actually been from a national retail association, and now he was helping write industry-wide guidelines for inclusive customer service. Sarah watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction. She'd recently received an offer to sell Riverside to a major luxury conglomerate for 3 times what she'd paid. Their letter promised to maintain the store's unique character while expanding it nationwide. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out her response, a polite but firm decline. "Some things aren't for sale," she explained to Maya over coffee. "What we're building here isn't just a store or even a program. It's a movement." She smiled as another group of fellowship students walked past their table, engrossed in a discussion about sustainable fashion. And movements need to grow organically, not through corporate takeovers. The story of Riverside Boutique's transformation spread far beyond Portland. Other retailers started launching their own inclusion initiatives. Designer brands that had once been hesitant to offer extended sizes or adaptive options were now competing to be more inclusive. The ripple effects were changing the entire industry. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during the first fellowship graduation ceremony. As Richard handed out certificates alongside Maya and Dr. Rivers, someone unexpected walked through the door. His grandmother, now in her 90s, who'd flown in from San Francisco to surprise him. She looked around the store that had once turned her away, at the rainbow of faces and styles, at her grandson who'd finally found his way to the right side of history. Then she did something remarkable. She walked up to the podium and shared her own story, bridging past and present, turning full circle from exclusion to inclusion. And that's the real power of this story. It's not just about one store's transformation or one man's redemption. It's about the courage to face uncomfortable truths, the strength to break cycles of hurt, and the vision to create something better. It's about understanding that true luxury isn't about keeping people out. It's about welcoming everyone in. Today, if you visit Riverside Boutique, you'll still find Maya running the show, Richard teaching new fellows, and a new generation of fashion entrepreneurs learning to build a more inclusive industry. The marble floors still shine, the chandeliers still sparkle, but now they light the way forward for everyone. Because sometimes the best endings aren't really endings at all. They're new beginnings. And this beginning, it's just the first chapter in a much bigger story of change. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about real change happening in our world. Remember, transformation starts with one person willing to stand up and say, "This needs to change." What will you help transform?